one thing that I did want to explore with you is just the kind of going back into the sense of validity and uh, the different potential uses of spiritual concepts and spiritual terms in a way that's actually dividing versus unifying. But it seems to have the flavor of unity. So since we're talking about discernment, there can be uh, sort of like a use of a term like compassion or love in a way that's actually supporting a dividing position. Yeah. But because it's using that term, to common perception, it would seem like it's very sophisticated, or it's somehow spiritual or supportive of everyone coming together. Mm. And uh, this is sort of like the wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will. It's got that look of being very, very helpful and very, very nice and very, very sweet and very, very unifying. But when we actually kind of have that sharp discernment, we're able to see that that's not what it seems to be. Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have anything to say about that, Aaron? I don't know.
Do you have, can you give me an example more specifically of what you
Yeah,
mean?
I can give you a more specific example. Let's say like the term compassion is one that can be used in this way. Compassion can be used as a word that is sort of thrown around in reference to, having like a soft tone of speech and
Mm-hmm.
not hurting anyone's feelings, making sure that everyone feels comfortable, everyone feels okay, everyone feels like they're being, everyone here feels like they're being heard and they're being respected, which is really impossible because the ego is always going to, have some sort of problem with whatever, just because that's the nature of its innocent survival oriented operation, to feel like something's not being met, something's not measuring up, and that there's some sort of a conflict. So that's just one example of how compassion could be used in a way that seems sophisticated, but it actually isn't. And that would only be to the degree that it appears to conceal our ability to stand in truth and to speak the truth, with confidence and with surety,
Mm-hmm.
in a very in a fullness of love that isn't necessarily concerned about how it's going to be received by,
Mm-hmm.
different people.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great topic because it is quite a nuance for those, especially those just coming into a true spiritual practice who maybe have been, into politics or some kind of societal system that uses these words colloquially like this. Compassion means you're meek and you're mild and you just don't step on toes and you talk quietly. Or peaceful, right, is another one. Peaceful means you're just a pacifist and you don't stand up for yourself because you just want peace. And I think it's pretty cool that the truth is quite the opposite. That those states of consciousness are very powerful states of consciousness. But are either of you familiar with David Hawkins' work very much?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so power versus force, right? The world's way of thinking would be force, acting against something to get a result. Force is always acting against something else, fighting something else, whereas power always works with or for. And so power is infinitely stronger than force because of that. Like a wave in the ocean or something, a wave, no matter how huge and powerful a wave gets, it's all working with itself. So the wave isn't getting hurt. When it crashes, it doesn't lose any energy or force at all. It just, by the nature of what it is, it creates so much power. And so on that map of consciousness, compassion is a 500 level, peace is a 600 level, but the lens of force-based thinking, or we could think of it as the negative polarity, which only knows force, sees those as states of weakness because they don't act against anything. But because of the nature of power, excuse me, because of the nature of power, it has such a dramatic depolarizing effect on negative energy that it sort of like truth versus illusions, right? The truth doesn't even really need to do anything. It just needs to be what it is and it wins the fight every time. Power is sort of like that. And Gandhi's a great example, bringing down the whole British Empire without firing a shot, with no violence whatsoever, just by igniting that state of consciousness in others that got them to a state of empowerment to say, no, we're going to stand for our freedom, stand for love and justice and truth and peace. And so they non-violently stood, against the mandates of the British Empire, and eventually they won their freedom back. That's, probably the greatest example of power that we have. So it's very subversive. It's very subtle because it doesn't announce itself like force does. Force likes to be, think of like Nazi Germany. It likes to be very, what's the word? It likes to peacock itself. It likes to show its strength. So it's very attractive to the ego. Whereas power comes humbly, softly, doesn't brag about itself, but nevertheless, it's infinitely stronger than force. So I think that's maybe one caveat we could speak of when we talk about compassion from what it actually is versus the way the world might see it. It's not at all a state of weakness. It's just that it doesn't need to prove itself to anyone, because its interest is not for itself, it's for the other. And we know that compassion can do things that that force could never do, like, for example, melting a frozen heart of someone who's cold and calloused towards life, towards others, a heart full of hatred or separation. One act of compassion, we see this in like movies and stuff, right? One act of compassion or true love for someone who's done me no good and has not helped me at all, but nevertheless, I reach out a hand to help them in their time of need. Just that one act can change someone's entire life and depolarize all that negative energy in them and start them on a new path, right? So power is such an amazing function of our true nature, in that it's just like reality. That reality, the universe is built on power, meaning it works for itself, it's self-organizing, it's self-correcting, and it never loses any energy when it accomplishes something. Whereas force is always bleeding and draining energy in whatever it does.
Yeah, beautiful. So it's really also very similar to the difference between doing and non-doing. It's sort of like compassion
Right.
doesn't need to do. It doesn't need to act in any particular way. It expresses itself spontaneously, but it's not coming from that causality based paradigm. And force is coming from that one-to-one push and shove kind of way of being or way of holding experience.
In your initial question, you were asking about how people see compassion as maybe it always should look a certain way, or love should always look a certain way, but it doesn't always fit into our boxes. And an example that came to mind was from a book I read called Love Everyone, which is a book about Maharajji, Ram Dass's guru. And I want to say it might have been Krishna Das. I'm not totally sure, but one of the students who writes in that book tells the story of when they went to India to be with Maharajji. The person writing was in this state of incredible suicidal depression, which I know very well from my past. And they wanted to get attention from Maharajji, and they were always saying stuff or asking questions to get Maharajji to be compassionate to them and say, oh, you poor suffering thing, you really must be so depressed. And Maharajji always ignored this guy. And he got more and more frustrated because he's like, come on, I came all the way to India to get some compassion from the guru and I'm not getting any. And they're on a walk. I think they would do a morning walk through the forest every day, like maybe a silent walk. And they're walking across this little river stream that's, ankle deep at best. And this guy's thoughts are racing and Maharajji's walking in front of him. And he sort of has a moment where he just loses it. And he has to express what's inside of him. And he starts yelling out, I can't do this anymore, Maharajji. I'm done. I'm just going to kill myself. I can't live another day in this life. And just lets it all express. And this was his ego's last attempt to really get Maharajji to acknowledge, look how much I'm suffering. Like, treat me like I'm special in some way. And of course, Maharajji, being on that level of awareness, always perceived that in him and never was going to give his ego that victim coddling it wanted. So even in the moment of him pronouncing he was about to go kill himself in the forest somewhere, Maharajji turns around and makes a joke. He says something like, What are you going to do? Drown yourself in the river? Haha. Turns around and keeps walking. And the guy's like so offended, right? That I just confessed that I'm suicidal and you just embarrassed me with this joke. So he gets frustrated. And as the moment that he was, I think he said he was going to like just start screaming at Maharajji in anger. How could you be so heartless? Maharajji turns around just before he speaks and he's got a tear streaming down his eye. And he says, no one really dies. Only Christ died the true death. And then he says, die like Christ. Die like Christ died. His tears flowing. And the man, whoever it was, it might have been Krishna Das, recognized right away that exactly what I just said is that this guru saw the state I was in, but also saw that my ego had a big stranglehold over me, that this depression, this suicidal identity had just consumed me and I wasn't able to see it. So in his great compassion, he was sort of irritating that ego to get it to come out. And then he delivered the pointer in the moment of the man's fragility. And he showed him, I have great compassion for you. And in fact, he said the tears I saw flowing from him, I knew that they were tears that he could feel what I feel. He was absorbing my suffering and showing me, I know what you feel, as gurus often do. But he made the point to say, you know, what his teaching was in that moment was the only real death you can die is to die to that separate self who's suicidal and depressed like Christ did. So he's like, hey, if you're going to commit suicide, commit the right kind of suicide. And he said the guy from that instant was completely free of his depression because of the accuracy and the space of the delivery of that pointer. I think it's so masterful to see someone on that level be in that kind of compassion, right? Because all of it was compassion, his ignoring of that stuff for weeks at a time. It was always out of his love for the guy. But from his point of view, his position, as we've been saying, he couldn't see that. So he was judging Maharajji for being cruel and heartless and not caring. And he ended up finding out that very much the opposite was the case.
Yeah. Beautiful story. That's great.